often folks will say, oh, he's writing about Muslim American identity. I'm not. No, I'm not.
Mm-hmm.
For many people, seeing characters who are struggling, in some cases with their place in this country as part of the sort of existential circumstance of their lives, becomes a political statement or becomes like some conscious artistic intention.
Do you like books?
I'm outlining a new writing project.
Who wrote this book?
Read it. What are you reading?
Sometimes I'd write something.
What are you writing?
Have you written anything lately?
I'm Amanda Stern, and this is Bookable. On today's show, identity politics. What happens when you write about the American experience from two opposing viewpoints? In novelist and playwright Ayad Akhtar's latest book, we follow the rise of Trump, white supremacy, and the consequences of falling prey to American capitalism when you're a hard-working immigrant. We asked Cathy Park Hong, poet and author of the critically acclaimed essay collection Minor Feelings, to talk to Ayad about his new novel, Homeland Elegies. Together, they enter deep territory discussing everything from books that break form, meta-narration, abandoned ideas, Black American cynicism, character, and the American immigrant experience. Their conversation is smart, insightful, political, and, to be quite honest, very occasionally over my head. Here's Cathy.
I just want to say it's amazing how you use the novel to track sort of the fall of American empire, its foreign policy, its unchecked capitalism, its racism, beginning from 9/11 to Trump. And I remember, I think, I was having this conversation with a friend. We couldn't think of any sort of definitive 9/11 novel or Trump novel. I don't really think such a novel exists. But I think if there was going to be, I was thinking at the time that if there was going to be any real honest appraisal of this time period, it wouldn't come from a white male writer, but a woman or a person of color. And I think your book really captures my theory. Two of the reasons why I love the book is because it doesn't, first of all, its form, it doesn't read as a typical or more conventional realist novel. It seems you're using the novel more as an argument or as an essay. It's not afraid to tell rather than just show. Because it seems like you're seeking to not only make people feel, but persuade. And underneath that, I think it's an indictment of a lot of the American values that we hold dear. But really, I also really fell in love with the book because of its characters, especially the father figure. Right. And for those who haven't really read the book, it begins with the narrator's father meeting Trump and becoming his doctor very briefly and being lured in by his charisma. And the father may or may not have voted for him in 2016. I think in the media, when they talk about the shy Trump voter, I'm thinking, oh, it's probably people like him, the mythical. I don't think there are as many shy Trump voters as people are afraid of, but I'm thinking, it's probably immigrants like him. But anyway, but I also love how a lot of you, the narrator's own personal familial connections were ensnared in a lot of these cataclysmic moments in recent history, such as 9/11 and this the war in the Middle East and the rise of Trump and white supremacy. And so I guess after my long-winded introduction, this is sort of kind of my question. I want to start with the character of the father. I have to say, I recognize so much of my own father in your father. I really did. I think.
Where is your dad?
My dad is in LA. He's Korean, and he's also this like sort of aspirational Asian immigrant.
Yeah.
But he's not like. But I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of these aspirational Asian immigrants are just kind of these cardboard cutouts of the hardworking immigrant, but
Right.
you really managed to kind of capture the kaleidoscope of insecurity, machismo, stubbornness,
That's right. Yeah. Yeah.
humor, affection, just everything that's infuriating about the immigrant dad.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could, and especially the immigrant dad who worships a church of American capitalism,
Right.
but then who ultimately becomes betrayed by it from other
Yeah.
corporate apex predators and racism. And I
Right.
think I could also relate to that with the story of my father. And
Right.
so I was just wondering if you could talk about this father figure, this father character, how you developed him, how you developed this character, um, and how challenging it was to make him such this kind of unvarnished, honest immigrant. Because you also talk about his racism too, which I think,
Sure.
even if it's fiction, it seems like it would be hard to write about.
Right. Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you for the amazing tribute at the opening.
Mhm,
And really, it touches me
mhm,
deeply. Some of the stuff you said.
mhm,
My dad. My dad is substantially the model of this father
mhm,
in the
mhm,
book, and
mhm,
and I couldn't. I wouldn't know how to. I wouldn't know how to create somebody who had so many sort of contradictions.
mhm,
I remember when I first encountered Falstaff in Henry the Fourth parts
mhm,
1 and 2, and I remember reading, this amazing character Falstaff and thinking, well, I know this guy. This guy's a lot like my dad. Um,
mhm,
I think that he has been a template for me of sort of contradiction and larger than lifeness. And I've been going to school on him as a kind of attempt to characterize and sort of put him down on paper, if you will, to kind of capture this sense
mhm,
of all these things you're talking about, the vulnerability and the machismo and the outsized gifts. He was a very gifted
mhm,
man and also a very generous man. And um,
mhm,
all of that stuff. So it wasn't too hard to write him. I think that the challenge for me personally was that I was losing my father to alcoholism, and I'd lost.
mhm,
He basically he had decamped about 2 years earlier, and in a way, I
mhm,
think writing the book was like an attempt to kind of bring him back, if you will. And
mhm,
as a dramatic writer, of course, I am concocting and I am sharpening edges and I am compositing and I am pushing things to an extreme. And I'm
mhm,
creating oppositions because I think that the stronger the oppositions, the more energy is created inside a story. And that's just
mhm,
my thinking as a dramatic writer. So I did
mhm,
take liberties, but the liberties I took ultimately were, they were intuitive. They were not conceptual. Um,
mhm.
Other than the fact that very obviously the mother and the father stand in as opposite poles
Yeah.
of responding to the American experience. And on
Mhm,
the one hand, you have the caricature of Trump as embodying the full spectrum of American individualism, and on the other hand, you have
mhm,
Bin Laden as standing in
mhm,
as a kind of critic of American imperialism. So
mhm,
between those two points of view on America, the politics of the book unfold.
mhm, mhm, mhm. Um, I figured that like it was actually based on your father, but I didn't want to say that outright.
Sure, of course. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Uh, but has he read it? Actually, has he read the book?
So the day that I have this very long chapter, as you know, that ends the book, which is about my father's, about a court case that my father, quote unquote, in the
Yeah.
book it
Mhm.
undergoes, and it's really kind of it's a portrait of Wisconsin, but it's also kind of a portrait of his belonging in America, or how it sort of ends. And
Mhm.
my dad, the day that I finished that chapter, I got a call from my brother that my dad was in ICU. He was taken to ICU and he died shortly thereafter. So
I'm
he
sorry.
died the
Yeah.
day I finished the book,
Oh, wow. Oh, yeah.
which was a very strange, as you know, as a writer, some strange things can happen to you when you're writing. You can
I know.
some very weird coincidences and stuff, and this was, the weirdest of them all. I
Mhm.
didn't worry that he would read it just because he was drunk most of the day, every day, and I can't imagine
Mhm.
he would have been able to read anything.
Mm-hmm.
And also, he was not a big reader. I mean, he was very much
Mm-hmm.
sort of like man of action and don't waste my
Mm-hmm.
time with staring at paper kind of guy. So I didn't worry too much about that. But I also knew in my gut, what I was doing to him. And I sort of stage it a bit in the book where, the writer leaves the journal out and then the father sees all the notes that he's taken. And, the father's concerned about how he's going to be portrayed in the book. I sort of unfolded some of my concerns and some of my worries about all of that into the book. But for the most part, I think my dad wouldn't have ultimately cared what I wrote about him. Knowing that.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, like,
Who reads books anyway?
I know, like my father, when I was working on my last book, he was like, am I in it? He's like, you write bad things about me, don't you? I know you do. But
yeah.
he never actually bothered to read the book because he doesn't really have time to read.
Yeah, exactly.
So, he part of his like flaws. I mean, I think what makes him so real is that he's a very flawed character, and like all of us. But his own vulnerability is not that he's American, but he's trying so hard to prove his Americanness. He's like a fan of America, rather than actually being naturally inhabited in whatever it is that is American. And that it made me think about this quote, and it's a very fraught quote, and I was just curious what your opinion of this of your own passage is.
Right.
The quote is, "We are more obsessed with what they think of us than what we think of ourselves. We spend way too much time trying to correct the impression the West has of who we are. We've turned this defensiveness into a way of life." Edward Said writes a book about how wrong they've been about us, and it becomes our Bible, a high road to self-knowledge. Constantly defining yourself in opposition to what others say about you is not self-knowledge. It's confusion. So I was wondering what your opinion of this passage is. Do you agree with this? Do you agree with it? And if so, how do Muslims, and I would also encompass other non-white immigrants, untether ourselves from that defensive position?
Yeah, that's an amazing question. I'm not sure exactly how to answer it. It's interesting when in writing a book full of characters, and one of them notably who has my name and many of the facts of my life. It's hard not to, I suppose, give off the impression that everything I quote unquote say in the book is something that I agree with. I wouldn't disagree with it. I mean, I think it's a limited perspective. I think it's an important. It's a thought that I've had in the past. It's a thought I've articulated to others within my community. It's not one that I think is as useful for members who are not of my community to hear, if that makes sense. How do we detether ourselves if the analysis of that quote is, has any validity, then how to detether? I mean, I think that by beginning to sort of recognize that deconstructive assertion is not a creative act, and that it's incumbent on me as a writer, say, to move beyond critique and to move beyond problematizing discourse, right? Foucault is great. Foucault doesn't tell us how to build a society. Foucault tells us how societies are built. And I sometimes worry that in this era of critical theory thinking, that we've confused deconstructive assertion or systemic analysis for a constructive, creative gesture. I think it's an important part of the context. You can't maybe come to a rightful gesture without it, but it's not enough. And I do worry that Edward Said at times has given some of us the blueprint to think that having an awareness of discursive construction is enough. I'm not sure that it is. And I say that as an artist. I say that as somebody who has to, at the end of the day, give the reader a deep emotional and intellectual and absorbing experience. It's not enough to get it right. I have to go much further than that.
I mean, I definitely agree with you. I think it's a provocative statement though, because
Yeah, sure.
especially in this time where it's like it almost seems as if there is no choice but to define yourself in opposition in this very oppositional era, and to do so would be to kind of almost like deflect accountability in a way, just because of how politicized this era
Yes.
has become.
Yes.
And I would argue, and you may disagree with me, but I would also argue what makes Homeland Elegies kind of a more provocative book rather than, I don't know, say like a coming of age novel, is that it is oppositional. It's oppositional in the sense that, I mean, I think it's artistic in its form and its portraits of all of these very contradictory characters, and also its drama and its and the tragic comedy in it. But it's also, I think, oppositional in that it gives a portrait of Muslims living in a Christian country, Christian
Sure.
land, right?
Yeah, sure. But this is the thing that I often run into, when with regards to the sort of identity politics of my own work, is that I'm just writing from a particular to a universal. I'm just writing about a group of people and a community and a
Yeah.
set of histories. And then from those people, I'm writing about love, and I'm writing about greed, and I'm writing about society, and I'm writing about the self, and I'm writing about all kinds of big stuff, big ideas, capital letter stuff. I'm not writing in any conscious way to counter some perception there is about, I'm often folks will say, oh, he's writing about Muslim American identity. I'm not. No, I'm not. It just turns out that for many people, seeing characters who are struggling in some cases with their place in this country as part of the sort of existential circumstance of their lives becomes a political statement, or becomes like some conscious artistic intention. It isn't really. I mean, I was trying to use my family to tell the story of what has happened to the American dream.
Yeah.
And so to me, I'm writing about America. I'm not writing in opposition to some perceived representation of Muslims, though I suspect if I do my job well, there's going to be a richness there that will belie some of the idiotic flattening that happens. But that flattening happens in bad fiction everywhere. I mean, it doesn't,
Yeah.
and it happens across all identities, and it happens across everything. I mean, it's just bad fiction is just bad fiction. So
Yeah. No, definitely. I mean, I think the book is not so much about identity as is. I mean, it's about a lot of things. It's not about just identity. It's about money. It's about capitalism. It's also, and it's very much, as I said before, it's an indictment of the American dream. And I would say that it's not just Muslims sort of defining themselves in opposition to what they're perceived as, but it's also kind of it's a kind of an oppositional look at sort of this national consciousness, this white
Right.
national consciousness that we have become, that we were sort of inculcated in throughout, at least throughout my life, and I'm seeing that overturned in a lot of American fiction and American poetry, is as, what is this myth? What is this American myth? And let's see what it kind of, what the kind of the histories that it's flattened. And I think for that, it's really powerful. I want to talk about jump to the Scranton section, and the the character's name is Riaz. Is that how you pronounce his name? Who is the quote unquote merchant of debt, and who is the founder of a hedge fund. And he's very charming and a kind of inscrutable philanthropist. And I've read a few descriptions of this book, and I've seen it being compared to Great Gatsby,
Right.
where he's this kind of Gatsby character. What would you say that's an accurate analogy? What would you?
It's really kind of a funny one. I mean, it's interesting. That particular review I found sort of perplexing. I guess that there are certain readers I have noticed. I have sort of clocked that there are certain readers who feel centrally seduced by that narrative at the heart of the book, and that there's something about the shadow that it casts for them across the rest of the events of the story that make them feel, I think, that that's the central narrative experience that they're having, right?
Yeah.
And I'm confused by that myself, because it is at the center of the book, and yes, it is there for a reason in a way, and that there is something very important that I'm trying to do and say and convey narratively with that. But I think that there are narratives, like most notably the father-son thing, that really is much larger frame for what this story is.
Yeah.
So I think it's a funny little twist that I'm discovering, and it's interesting that you bring it up, that it also struck you that way, because I do think that it partakes of a certain American there is a certain American archetype that story plays along with, and that I think there is a way in which that familiarity enables or allows, in contradistinction to the representation of the father and the sort of like the story of the father and son, which is not a traditional immigrant story, as I gather, and it's something that a lot of people are saying. So I don't, it's hard to say. I mean, how do you account for it? What are your thoughts about that?
I wasn't think Great Gatsby wasn't the first
And me neither.
reference I had in mind. I thought but I think I read that review. I don't remember what it was, but before I picked up the book, I read that review, and so I thought the book was gonna be about these two characters, and instead it's multiple characters, father and and your extended family, and so it was, and that's one. I mean, it's definitely an important section in the book. For me, it reminded me. Riaz reminded me of this anecdote. Actually, he represents a kind of my own personal familiar trope of an immigrant or a second generation immigrant. It reminds me of this one time where I was at this bar, and I never hang around hedge funders, but I went to a bar, and there were these hedge funders for this friend's birthday party, and I met a Korean American hedge funder, and he was he was very successful. He was a billionaire, I believe. And I was just very drunk at the time, and I was asking people, there were some Asians in the bar, and I was just sort of asking them, do you think Asian men are more self-hating or Asian women are more self-hating?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so I went up and I was curious what he would say. So I asked him, I was like, what do you think? Do you think Asian men are more self-hating or women are more self-hating? I was sort of doing this research for this book. And then he said, without hesitation, men and Asian men. And I said, why? And he said, well, and obviously this is very misguided of him to say, he said, well, everyone wants Asian women, like white men, black men, Latino men, they all want Asian women. No one wants Asian men. But then he said, but there are more Asian men who are getting into Harvard and Yale and all of these Ivy League schools and any other demographic. And soon will be more powerful than the Jews. And I was thinking of, I don't know, I was thinking of that person, that guy.
Sure,
who,
of course.
When I was
totally
thinking
get it. Totally
when I was thinking of Riaz, and I was thinking about just sort of I don't know. It just gets complicated when you're kind of when capitalism collides with racism, or
Hmm.
and that's why I found, and that's why I don't see him so much as a Gatsby. Well, maybe, but like, I just found him to be very compelling. How he was
Hmm.
using his
Hmm.
power as a form of vengeance, and
Yeah,
so and how this Korean guy was also sort of using it to kind of to prove his masculinity in a way,
sure.
and
Well, I mean, that's the thing is that prosperity, American prosperity, is the great is believed to be the great equalizer,
yeah.
and that if Riaz is in pursuit of his first $1 billion because if he can become, the best of if he can become part of the minority of the best, that
Mm-hmm.
he will then finally be, an American, that he will feel fully American.
Hmm.
And, it's a strategy that many people in the book, they have different strategies to do that. I have an uncle in the book named Shafat who becomes a Christian to solve the question of American belonging. And
Hmm.
Asha, later in the book, thinks that being with a basketball player is going to do that, and then thinks that
Hmm.
arranging her own marriage with a Pakistani is going to do some form of that. And the narrator himself goes through many different iterations of sort of, how to solve this question. But I think that certainly that the money solution, if you will, is one that a lot of folks, it sounds like folks or at least encountered, a lot of people I know have settled on that as a strategy to sort of solve this problem.
Hmm. Hmm. Um, well, so I was thinking of that Wakanian quote you said, where you said we desire the desire of the other,
Hmm.
and which seems to be the crux of the problem of this country. And I don't know. I mean, as we're, I wonder though. I mean, do you think? No, I mean, we're heading. This is a question that's sort of drifting from the craft of the book and so forth.
Sure, that's
But
all good, all good. I'm happy to talk about
yeah, but
wherever
I'm
this
just
goes.
wondering then, is this like, I mean, does capitalism then trump all? Does it matter? You think that, like, America, where the immigrants, the black and brown immigrants are going to be the majority in 2050, if
Yeah,
if if capitalism, if we continue, if it's going to be
yeah.
uh if you're continuing to if we're going to continue living in this neoliberal system, then it doesn't matter who is, if this country
I
is
think
white or majority black or majority brown or majority anything.
I do worry, Kathy, that the identity politics analysis of the ailments of the country is short sighted. And
Uh-huh.
I do worry that the real issues are fundamentally economic, and that the systemic problems are, sure, we've got racism, no question,
Uh-huh.
but the systemic economic issues are actually existential, and not just existential to a particular, group of people, but to the species. And
Uh-huh.
and I don't know that. It seems to me that capitalism is an equal opportunity, it's a system that benefits anybody who understands how to align itself with that system. And so I don't know that. I'm not sure. And I think it's probably clear from the book that I'm not convinced that racial justice, pursuing racial justice over pursuing these more fundamental. We can do them both, but not giving as much attention to the economic
Uh-huh.
questions, I think is ultimately going to serve us, is not going to serve us well, is my worry.
Well, it's inextricable. I
Yeah.
think you
Yes.
can't separate the two. You have to, and you
But
can't
you,
talk
but you,
about,
but you can. I mean, that's what you just suggested that we could, and I think that's the shadow side of this, is
uh-huh.
that achieving success. At the end of the day, if folks are able to make, Mike Jacobs in the book is, he's a
Yeah.
libertarian Republican who is using all his money and all his wealth to make Black lives better in America, and
Uh-huh.
Riaz is doing the same thing for Muslims, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
so they're taking care of their own kind, if they prevail, they will help usher in a new era of empowerment for a particular group of people. But the predatory system that is despoiling the actual nation itself
Uh-huh.
is still very much it's still very much at work.
Uh-huh.
So I do think that those things can be decoupled. I think that it's hard to make progress on the racial justice front without addressing some of the economic issues. But I think that if we don't focus more clearly on the economic issues that affect the entire nation and by extension, the entire world, the human population, we're going to have a rough go of it.
Time for a short break. When we come back, Ayad tries to demystify a friend's politics and examines how America pillages itself. Stick around. Welcome back to this Bookable conversation with Cathy Park Hong and Ayad Akhtar.
I want to actually pivot to Mike Jacobs' character, but
Sure,
I do think that it's not. I mean, I think a lot of the concerns right now is not simply identity politics. It seems like with a lot of, at least people of color, it's racial capitalism. It's rather than lifting up oneself, or I think a lot of people have soured on the idea of individual triumph. And I want to talk about Mike Jacobs.
Sure.
I think that he's, I wanted to talk about how you, he's the, a chapter is devoted on this Hollywood agent who's Black, and he's Republican, and he believes he's very, probably like Riaz, he's almost very cynical. I would kind of call him an Afro-pessimist who believes
Right.
there's no way to redeem this country.
Right.
So he decides to vote Republican. And
so that he doesn't have to pay taxes, so he doesn't have to pay money to the U.S. government.
Yeah, but he doesn't have to pay money. But then, and I was thinking about, this like just recently about other, how a lot of there are more Black and Latinx male voters who are supporting Trump in 2020 more so than in 2016. But it's not just that he doesn't want to pay more taxes. It's also because he doesn't think that his money is going to any programs that will help Black people, even if it's a Democrat in power. So he wants to take control of his own money and give it to Black programs himself. And I was, what inspired you to write this character, and why did you decide to incorporate him in a book that, mostly takes on the perspectives of other Muslim Americans?
So Mike is based on somebody real, somebody that I've known quite some time. Mike's politics have, as I say in the book, or as the narrator who has my name in many of the facts of my life says in the book, his politics have always baffled me. And so, Mike's perspective felt like the perfect perspective to begin to understand some of the things we were just talking about, was just sort of the larger economic despoiling of the country that is not about race, that is really about what Mary at the top of the book suggests is a kind of colonial pillage, that the country has been pillaging itself and plundering itself, and individuals have treated America not as a homeland, but as a place to make their fortunes, and that there really isn't any abiding sense of loyalty to a collective. There is the abiding sense of loyalty to oneself and to fulfilling the American dream, if you will. Like that becomes the sort of ideological, I don't know, the sort of the short form signifier for a whole bunch of other stuff, right? And so Mike, in the book, Mike offers a very clear way into an analysis of just how the politics of the last 40 years, notably antitrust regulation, has led to a landscape where communities, where the heartland has been, sort of impoverished, where the rural regions have become impoverished, and where the consumer getting the lowest price seems to have come to stand in for a kind of social covenant, above all. And that his argument as a Black American, and his ability to sort of see that because of his father's history, but also because of his own politics, provides, I think, an important dimension of this picture. This picture, which at the end of the chapter, the narrator, encounters "It's a Wonderful Life" for the umpteenth time, but after this conversation with Mike Jacobs, realizes that Frank Capra was sort of expressing a vision of this version of America all along, and that it really did map against property rights, that it really was about property, and that the perspective of property is different than the perspective of, the human, if you will. And that this is a deeper struggle that's playing itself out, and property has very clearly won. It's won so extraordinarily. I mean, it's the concussive, decisive victory of property rights is evidenced by the world economy being fueled by debt. That these things are interconnected. So that's that. It was important for me, I think, to it was a kind of just it wasn't planned. I got to that point in the book, and I knew that I would be pivoting. I was sort of coming into the home stretch, and I was coming back to the fundamental picture. I needed to draw a very large version, very large, sort of a short chapter with a very large vision of the picture. I knew what that picture would be, and I knew that Mike was going to play some part in that because, again, as I said, he's based substantially on somebody real.
Yeah, no, I think he definitely seemed like he was based on a real character, and I would say that was one of the chapters that I found to be a little bit surprising and a little bit shocking, because I haven't seen that kind of seen that perspective. I haven't read that perspective before. However, definitely the cynicism and a lot of Black Americans not believing in American democracy because they've been shut out of the promise of accruing wealth and having property and themselves being property.
Right.
But that, which also, of course, differentiates Mike Jacobs, who's Black too, from an immigrant. Let's see.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think that's partly also part of it too. Is that as a member of the sort of first generation born here immigrant class, I think that there's been a kind of intellectual coming of age for me that I've had to go to school on forms of the Black experience that I've been able to sort of make sense of and internalize to whatever degree I can, whether it was Malcolm X or James Baldwin or whatever it may be, or Mike, or who for a time has really been one of my closest friends. So I think learning about race identity in America as a first generation, sort of Pakistani American, I have had to understand a little bit better, or tried to understand a little bit better, what it means to be Black in this country to make sense of those questions.
Well, I mean, because it's like if you think about Black enslavement, that is inextricable from capitalism, right? Because a lot of the accrual of capital in this country is based on Black bodies, using Black bodies as collateral. But and it seems like that chapter on Mike Jacobs kind of speaks to that, or that's a lot of where the foundation of his cynicism is that he's just like, it's just never gonna, this isn't gonna change. It's unchangeable. And maybe this is some of the, and there, I think you see kind of like the existential it's rage or existential acceptance, or
Right, right, right,
just
right,
like this is how it is, and so I
right,
might as well game the system, which I
right.
think is it's even again it seems different than real. I don't know why, but it just seems more.
Oh, I think it is. I think
Yeah,
Riaz, first of all, is it's a different echelon of
yeah,
wealth and a different ability to affect, and also a different ambition. Riaz is
uh-huh,
seeking to have a kind of role that Sheldon Adelson has in American politics. I mean,
uh-huh,
he has a pretty high dream. Mike probably doesn't have the same. He's probably happy to spend a few $100,000 a year on some programs that really mean a lot to him, or whatever it may be. He doesn't have that sort of expansive ambition, and I think it's part of why the narrator says, it felt like bullshit to me, like it was cover for what he wanted to do, which was to make money and keep his money.
uh-huh, yeah. Um, I want to talk about the book itself. I was
Sure.
wondering. I think you probably get asked this question a lot about going from a playwright to a novel, and I was curious, like, what are some of the books that served as a model for you for this book that were an inspiration when you were when you're trying to figure out the format of this book?
It's interesting. There was one book that kind of set off the writing, if you will, the
Mm-hmm.
sort of like,
Mm-hmm.
and that was Bellows Ravelstein.
Mm-hmm.
There was a kind of it was Chick in Ravelstein is clearly Saul Bellow, and Ravelstein is clearly Alan Bloom, and so it was
Mm-hmm.
a very much it's sort of one-to-one roman à clef that felt precariously close to memoir, and
Mm-hmm.
there was a kind of vividness of characterization that was married to
Mm-hmm.
really rich social history. And
Mm-hmm.
at Bellow doesn't ever sort of engage in outright social history, but he comes close. I mean, it's a short
Mm-hmm.
novel, so it's a very different.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that there was the ambition to marry ideas, experience, sensual detail, and and strong, vivid characterizations. I think the
Mm-hmm.
idea of that kind of an alloy came from reading Ravelstein, which I read just before I started writing this book, and I didn't know I was going to be writing this book. But I
Mm-hmm.
remember thinking, "Wow, this is just God. Why can't I write like this?" So
Mm-hmm.
I think and I think the other big template for me, and I look back now, and it's clear that this book has been cooking in me for at least a decade, and I recognize all these abandoned ideas that have been ended up sort of finding form here in this story,
Mm-hmm.
in this series of stories. Um, was it the Philip Roth trilogy? American
Mm-hmm.
Pastoral, I Married a Communist, and Human Stain, and the sort
Mm-hmm.
of way in which, again, the contiguousness of the narrator's consciousness with the text
Mm-hmm.
makes it start to feel like there's a very intimate address to the reader.
Mm-hmm.
And this notion, sorry, there's a passing train here in downtown
Oh,
Chatham.
sure.
Let me just hold on a sec.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Um, that to me married to the larger theme of the social construction of the South, and
Mm-hmm.
so I think those were the kinds of books that informed the ambition, or the sort of at least the texture of what it was. But as far as the formal dimension of it, I didn't have a template other than to know that I'd read so many wonderful books over the years that broke form. Whether it
Mm-hmm.
was Moby Dick, or whether it was Tristram Shandy, or
Mm-hmm.
or Walden, which isn't a
Mm-hmm.
novel, but still there's a freedom that if you have the craft to do it, you can pretty much do whatever you want inside a novel. This has, I
Mm-hmm.
think, been demonstrated time and again in the history of the form. So I think I was less. I knew that there would probably be people who just weren't going to come along for the ride, and that was just what it was. And in this time of online merchandise and
Mm-hmm.
sort of online groupthink and all of that, so
Mm-hmm.
there is an increasingly prescriptive version of what a novel is in its commercial embodiment, even in the literary form. So I knew there might be some resistance to something that was a little bit more whatever highfalutin or the hijinks of form and whatnot. But it didn't matter to me so much. I just thought I'm gonna see if I can do this and just let the cards fall where they may.
Maybe because I'm a poet, but I think that my favorite kinds of novels are novels that always defy the genre in some way.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Me
Did
too.
you?
Me too.
Yeah, and there are a lot of those. There are a lot of
Yeah.
those, and I think that's what keeps the genre alive. I was curious about the process in writing the book. I know a lot of these characters are based on real people. I was wondering if you, what the research process was like. Did you go back and interview many of these people? Was there any kind of reporting involved, or, or
Mhm.
maybe you could even speak about your
Sure.
experience as a playwright?
Yeah.
Hmm.
It's a motley group. I mean, some of the characters are concocted,
Hmm.
some of
Hmm.
them are composited. So I have a couple
Hmm.
of characters that are really strong composites of a few different points of view.
Hmm.
And then there are two or three characters who, Mike Jacobs being one of them,
Hmm.
who is substantially based on somebody real. It's
Hmm.
interesting. In Mike's case, I
Hmm.
shared that chapter with the original subject of
Hmm.
the portrayal, and
Hmm.
I asked him to make comments. And where I quote him, that is his quote. So,
Hmm.
but
Hmm.
he did not want to be formally attributed as such.
Hmm.
Um, in the case of my father, there's a lot of deforming of fact that's going into the portrayal of my father, but it again is substantially real. And
Hmm.
in the case of the court case, my father did go through a malpractice lawsuit in his career. It was about 10 years before he actually ended up ending his career. So it wasn't quite at the end of his career. But I did do a lot of research and interviews of lawyers, and I had all of the court transcripts. And
Hmm.
but again, I substantially departed in actually shaping the court experience. I departed from the original. I often say
Hmm.
that I do all this prep and I do all this preparation and all this research, and sometimes
Hmm.
it'll be months and months and months of research,
Hmm.
and then I'll quickly write a draft. And a lot of times I do all the research to be able to understand the difference between an arbitrary surprise and a creative surprise.
Hmm. Hmm.
And because if I don't, then I can just get lost I can walk down some path that leads to a dead end if I don't really
Hmm.
understand very fully the world that I'm writing about.
Hmm.
So it ran the gamut. There was a lot of research in a couple of instances, as the court case, and also to some extent this thing about Mike. But a lot of the other stuff was, as I said earlier, been cooking for so many years. I'd been accumulating, all kinds of stories and episodes and scenes, and a friend who had encountered the SEC and the details of that get folded
Hmm.
into my own account of the narrator and encountering the SEC, and it's all of that stuff. It's just a typical sort of writer accumulating material over the course of a lifetime, if you will.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, no, it definitely reads like that. Also, I was interestingly in the book, and I guess this is why it's sometimes part of the reason why people say autofiction or whatever, but which has kind of become a sort of played term. But you do there's some meta narrative moments in your book, or I don't even know if meta narrative is a way to call it, intertextual, where you write about your play and the reception of your play, and I thought that was really interesting.
Hmm.
And it seems to be, at first it seems ostensibly it kind of reads as a defense of your play, but more it seems to be like it seems like you write about the reception of your play as kind of to open up kind of these larger debates about uh, politics and politics and audience and art making. And maybe the last time, but it specifically, it seems to be the Muslim reaction to your play, you
Sure.
know, and then the last, and perhaps maybe one of the more sympathetic uh, people who react to your plays is this. And confess I haven't seen it. Is Sultan, who says everybody has flaws. We're no exception. We're under attack in this country now. We have to stick together. So I wanted
Right.
to. I was wondering if you could talk about that. Why you chose to be so transparent about this narrator's play that is your play, and why you decided to talk about its reception.
So the opening of the book begins with an account
Mm-hmm.
of the narrator's father's relationship to Donald Trump, which eventually leads to his support of Donald Trump during the election,
Mm-hmm.
2015, 2016, or during the campaign. And the problems that arise, the problems that arise between father and son because of that. And sort of,
Mm-hmm.
I knew at the end of that chapter that the immediate question that the reader would have in retrospect, sort of thinking back on what they just read, is how much of this is real. so
Mm-hmm.
so the beginning of the next chapter is called On Autobiography, in
Mm-hmm.
which I address both directly and indirectly the question of the veracity of what people are reading. But I address that question of veracity by speaking about another work, not the one that they're reading now, but another one that I had written before.
Mm-hmm.
And I give an example of how I am asked about, that work, and I'm asked about how much of me is in it, and what people are really inquiring about is about my politics, which then leads to a story about my mother, which I allege, or the narrator alleges, is the real source
Mm-hmm.
of the material that was in the play that has everybody so hot
Yeah.
and bothered, right?
Yeah.
So all of this is a very elaborate hermeneutic maneuver on my part to both enlist the reader in this trompe l'oeil, if you will, this tricking of the eye, no pun intended, and on the other hand, also to begin to tread the ground of what's ahead, which will eventually lead to the episode with Riaz. Because on the one hand, the narrator is going to go through a real rise in the world, if you will
Yeah.
achieve a version of the American dream to some consequence, to some nefarious consequence on the one hand. And so the vehicle of that transformation will be this play. And on the other hand, it also allows me, the writer, to begin to open up some of this contested ground around representation of Muslims, and how a writer who is both writing about but not identifying as overtly, but identified as by others overtly, a Muslim writer, is dealing with all of these questions as they pertain to his own experience in America. Because that, of course, is the subject of the Scranton chapter, where the narrator gets to the end of that chapter and says, I was going to stop pretending I felt like an American. And that paradoxically, that epiphany is what leads to his success as a writer in America. So bringing the play was a very useful way for me to begin that process of doing all of that stuff. Now, that's the obvious sort of like, at least the formal and the sort of conscious part of it. I'm sure there's some unconscious dimension to it, which is, I have had to account for my intentions and all of that sort of stuff with some of my work over the past few years in the theater, especially after Disgraced won a Pulitzer and got so much attention. I've had to sort of speak to what the play is and what it isn't. And, I have been subject to many, many misreadings, most of them very positive, which is often, I often joke is really the only reason I have a career, is because I've been misread so positively by people. And so the paradoxes of all of that, being an artist in an increasingly politicized discursive environment, trying to write to something that is not necessarily political, but also, all of those sorts of those dimensions, those questions which preoccupy me, which are part of the experience that I'm writing about. It felt like it was the perfect segue. It was the perfect way in, if you will. and does allow me to partake of this, as I said, this trompe l'oeil. People have been using the term autofiction. I think of it less as autofiction because I think autofiction has a kind of inherent distance between the reader and the narrator. The writer almost has to go out of his or her way to sort of say, yes, I know it's based on me, but this is not me. But here the book is really saying, you know what? I want you to confuse this with me, and I'd like to get closer to you, reader, than usual. And so I kind of think of it more like a literary version of kind of reality TV seduction, if you will.
Reality TV. I guess it would be a more popular, lower brow. Although I don't know, there's a lot of quality reality TV there out there too. I think I was thinking about that as you were opening it up. You started with the play, with your play, and then it opened up to the speaker's mother, and how I guess the quote that was very controversial: "They deserve what they got and what they're going to get." Right.
Right.
And that's it being attributed to the mother figure, who I found to be a very compelling and tragic and complex woman, and I was and as well as the other women in your book as well. I just had one, which I would love to get to, but we're almost out of time, and I just wanted to ask one question,
Sure.
one last question. The book ends, with father ends up back in Pakistan,
Yeah.
and the narrator, after renouncing his Americanness, calls America his home.
Yeah.
And I thought it made the book complete in a way. But I'm wondering, I have to ask, since we're only a few days away from Tuesday.
Right.
Yeah, and you coming from Wisconsin,
Yeah.
Milwaukee, like, what are your thoughts now, in terms of this country? A lot of your book is kind of covers the trauma of 2016, the elections, and do you have any? I don't know. You could just really say anything, any thoughts or
Sure.
predictions about.
I don't have a prediction. I mean, obviously, I think we all are sort of thinking. I think maybe with better reason to think so. That we'll probably have an outcome at the end of whatever this next period is that will be a little bit saner for our lives. I do continue to worry that the underlying structural tensions and problems, that Trump was not the problem. He ended up becoming a problem.
Yes.
He has been a big problem. He's almost like, if the cancer was caused by some toxicity in the environment, well, the cancer is ultimately what ends up killing you. But if you cure that cancer and you don't change the environment, you're going to have cancer again. And I think that we're in an environment where, yes, it's incumbent on us. It's imperative that we get rid of Trump. But I think he's not the problem. And that we've created an environment where Trump is possible. And that, to me, I mean, look, I don't want to stretch the far metaphor too much, but I have spoken on a couple of occasions about parallels with the late Roman Republic. And one of the things that I think, in retrospect, with a hindsight of a few thousand years, we can sort of see that Caesar's attempt to centralize power, which was expressing some breakdown in the society, not entirely caused by Caesar's own will to power, but that his will to power was an expression of some impulse within the society, a Hegelian reading of the events. That Caesar's attempt to centralize power did not succeed, and that the Republic fighting back only served to actually undermine the rest of those Republican fundamentals that led ultimately to Augustus. And that Augustus was the one who centralized power and led to 200 years of prosperity and peace, but under authoritarian rule. And that I worry that there are parallels if you look at the relationship of the aristocrats to the social body, and you look at sort of the collapse of the breakdown of the monopoly on violence that the state generally tends to have and which legitimizes its rule. I think that there is a case to be made that we are in the very earliest stages of a collapse of certain fundaments that could very well lead to the kind of centralizing of power that Trump has represented in its kind of dysfunctional form, and that its next embodiment will be far, far more effective. And so 24, 28, I mean, I think that there are much larger societal questions at play here. And to me, they all ultimately boil down to where the money is going. And I don't see it as simple as billionaires own everything, though I think that's certainly a valid way of seeing it, an important sort of gloss on it. I think that the system has incentivized decision-making in a certain way, and that this monetizing imperative is creating a whole set or whole thicket of problems for us that, if we don't figure out how to deal with, are going to continue to create the kind of widespread discontent and nihilism that has led to Donald Trump. So, that's sort of my larger sort of thing about it. I hope that we can move the needle in a positive direction, and hopefully this younger generation of folks thinking about something other than individualism, and maybe there will be meaningful economic reform, and that we will begin to countenance the possibility of things like community stakeholdership when it comes to shareholder rights. And there's just a lot of stuff that's off the table in 21st century America because the ideological soil has been so fully tilled. And so we can't really even talk about certain things. But hopefully that'll change. One hopes that can change.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Cathy and Ayad, for such an insightful and meaningful conversation. I will now go look up some words in the dictionary. Cathy Park Hong is the author of Minor Feelings. It's published by One World and is available now. Ayad Akhtar is the author of Homeland Elegies, a novel. It's published by Little Brown and Company and is also available now. Bookable is a production of Loud Tree Media. I'm your host, Amanda Stern, 5 feet tall, but 5'8" if you're using the Electoral College. We're produced by me, Bo Friedlander, and Andrew Dunn, who also mixes and sound designs the show. Bo is Loud Tree's editor-in-chief. Find us on the web at bookablepod.com and subscribe and rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows. And if you want to learn more about our guests, find us on Instagram at bookablepod and follow me, your host, at A Little Stern. We're back next week with another new episode of Bookable, and we will see you then. This is Bookable.